So good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining. I am Jessie with Kentucky Youth Advocates. It's good to see all of you again or to see you for the first time. Thank you for joining today's forum about elections and electoral advocacy. Just a reminder that we are recording today's forum to share as a podcast and as a video, so you can see those recordings later. So if you don't mind just keeping yourselves muted, but if you have questions or comments, please feel free to share those in the chat. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Terry, who is then going to have a chat with our Secretary of State, who is joining us today. I am geeking out just a little bit. Terry?
Great. Thanks so much, Jessie. I think we start every week by saying we are so glad for you perfect attendance participants, and we are so glad for folks who are joining us for the first time. Our purpose today is when, where the rubber hits the road. We have talked to representatives from the Beshear administration. We've talked with Senate and House leaders about kids and COVID. In the last couple weeks, we have spoken with Leader McConnell's office and Congressman Yarmuth himself to talk about federal action, all of which is really important that you make your voices heard as those decisions are made. But I don't know, you may have heard that this November there's an election, and that's really where the action starts. So we wanted to take today and try to tackle this big issue of electoral advocacy, and we're going to do that in three ways. We're going to begin by talking to the guy in charge, and Mr. Secretary, I'm really excited to engage in just a minute with you on that. Afterward, Jessie is going to talk about a toolkit that, and we know the folks on these calls are in the weeds. You know your stuff, but we want to try to help you help other folks engage electorally. She's going to talk about that. And then the last thing, we're delighted to have former Representative John Tilley on, and I'm going to do a little riff on former Secretary Tilley, but we want to get his view from a candidate's perspective as to what you and your colleagues should really be doing as this election season heats up. So I'm going to begin the opportunity today, and we're going to engage our Secretary of State. It is very easy, but it is absolutely no fun to read the official biography of Michael Adams, and we're going to post that. And you can read about him growing up in Paducah, about his wife and daughter, about him being a McConnell Scholar at the University of Louisville, earning his, which I believe is the first college degree in his family. You can read about him earning his law degree at Harvard. That's no fun. No offense, Mr. Secretary, but instead I like to think of the Secretary of State in more personalized ways. I mean, first of all, I find his approach to be filled with humility of leadership. I love one tweet I found where he declared, "I began my race trailing my well-known opponent by 13 points. However, after I gave my speech at Fancy Farm, I trailed her by 15 points. I mean, that's kind of humble and rare. I also think he's really creative. I mean, who else launches a campaign to recruit young poll workers by messaging on craft beer cans and kicks off the campaign by tweeting, 'I began collaborating with breweries at the age of 21. Way to go, Mr. Secretary. Thirdly, I think you're going to find that he speaks the truth in very powerful and very understated ways. When he most recently was besieged by criticism about election process decisions, his response, he said, "I will rely on my good knowledge and my good conscience in making every decision." My good knowledge and my good conscience. I think that's pretty powerful. So welcome, Mr. Secretary. When you were running for office, you repeatedly said that your mission was to make voting easy and cheating hard. So I'd like you to take that theme, and I'd like to open by, first of all, letting you give us just a landscape on what's the scene as Election Day approaches. How have you made voting easy and cheating hard?
Well, thank you all for having me. Terry, thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'd like to consider myself what Churchill once said about somebody, a humble man with much to be humble about. So that's the kind of view I bring to this. So my campaign slogan was, let's make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. When I proposed a photo ID to vote bill, that was the hard to cheat part, and that was somewhat controversial. But turns out what's way more controversial is making it easy to vote. I've taken way more heat for making it easy to vote in a pandemic than anything else I've done. But to me, it's critical. I came into office with this position being at a low point. We had some scandals in the prior years before I came into this position, and to me, it was important for Kentuckians of all parties, all viewpoints, to have confidence in our elections, confidence in our system. And that can't work if you've got someone who's partisan at the top of the election system. You can't be a hack. You can't be seen as a hack. You got to be fair, neutral, and objective. And that means that in my acceptance speech last year, I went out of my way to say, if you didn't vote for me, I work for you. So that's the approach that I try to bring every day. I'm really proud that in our primary, we had historic turnout. It wasn't an accident that we had historic turnout during a pandemic. Everything was against us, but we showed the country, showed the world that we could do this and do it well. And not only did we have a huge turnout, but we had no spike in COVID-19 cases, despite hundreds of thousands of people voting in person. And we also had no election fraud. That was a real concern, moving to a different sort of approach, but we handled it. So we've been very creative in making voting easier, but also including protocols to make sure that no one's voting in someone else's name. I'm really proud of all that. I'll just give you a quick preview of November, and then I'll turn it back over. If you liked what we did in June, I think you'll like November even better. The governor and I worked together back in the spring on the plan for the primary. And again, it was a nationally recognized success. I've had Democratic and Republican secretaries of state around the country calling me, asking, what's your secret sauce? How'd you do it? I testified to Congress last Friday. They sent me an invitation to come testify and tell them about what we're doing in Kentucky. I'm really proud of that. My thought, and the governor agreed for November, is that we should take the best of what worked and keep it. And we should take the things that we didn't like as much and tweak those. So I'll tell you what we're tweaking. Number one, we're going to have more in-person voting in two respects. Number one, we're going to start early in-person voting 3 weeks out instead of 2 weeks out. That gives people 3 full weeks, including Saturdays, to go vote in person. Next, we're going to have more sites for Election Day. I don't know a hard number yet. I've got a big stack of election plans on my desk. This is what the counties have given me so far. This is 33 out of 120 counties. One thing that's different about November is in June, we let the counties make their decisions about their polling locations. This time, the governor and I each get veto power over a county's plan to reduce their voting locations. So I think we'll have a lot more. And the third big difference is this time, we're going to have earlier results. Every other state that's voted since about March has had to delay their announcement of results until about a week after the election at best. We did that in June, July. It wasn't very popular. The candidates want to know who won. The voters want to know who won. So we've made some tweaks so we can have earlier results on election night. It won't be all the votes. We'll have some outstanding yet to be processed, but we'll probably have about 75% of the votes counted election day instead of 25% as in the primary. So I think we're in a pretty good position for a very successful election.
Great. Thank you so much. You know, one of the most unique things about how Kentucky is proceeding, and I find that such a compliment to both you and the governor, is we at KYA talk a lot about common ground, common solutions for common good. What a great example of common ground agreements. It's easy to describe Frankfurt as bifurcated, polarized, balkanized. Yet you guys really came together and tackled arguably one of the hot button issues and kind of came out together. Again, the folks on this call, they kind of like Mr. Secretary inside baseball. So talk a little bit about how in the world did that happen? What was the process? Because I would love to think we could learn from that and build some other Andy Beshear Republican office holder common ground approaches.
Well, I didn't get much attention in my campaign, but I did talk consistently for 21 months all across the state about the need to find common ground and avoid tribalism, try to find things that we can agree on. I talked about as Secretary of State, I'm the custodian of the state seal. It's two people, a guy in formal dress, a guy in buckskin shaking hands. That reflects our diversity as a state, different interests, different socioeconomic backgrounds, education levels, and so forth, urban versus rural. We got to find something to shake hands on. Otherwise, our government's doomed. We got to find ways to work together. I'll be very honest. When the governor and I first started negotiating back in April, it was a little bumpy. We started negotiating, and then the governor line item vetoed the part of the bill out that had me in it that made me an equal partner in forming the election plan. And so we shut down negotiations for a little while. But eventually, we worked it out. We've got a great relationship now. I trust him. He trusts me. We work together on a daily basis. You don't have to agree on everything, and you can still trust but verify. But at the end of the day, we're all in this together, especially in a time of crisis. The voters voted for a Democratic governor and lieutenant governor and a Republican Secretary of State. If they put all Democrats or all Republicans in, that's one thing. But the message I take from the voters is they want divided government, and they want us to work together. They didn't send us here to gridlock for 4 years. So I have, of course, great relations as well with the Attorney General and others on the Republican side, but I've got to work with the governor. He's our governor. I remember after 9/11, Al Gore said, George W. Bush is my president. I thought that was very statesmanlike of him to say, look, despite differences, he's in charge. And it's the same thing here. I'm his Secretary of State, and he's my governor.
Thank you so much. Instead of just reflecting news reports, I looked at your actual testimony in front of Congress. The line that jumped out at me was, I think I'm reading this accurately, in Hollywood, New York, or here in Congress, they put out false and hateful tweets that riled up citizens of other states to jam our phones with obscene calls and even death threats. Everything they accused us of and everything they predicted would happen was just flat wrong, and they should all be ashamed. So I'm not talking about those people on the left or on the right, but I do sense that there are some thoughtful folks in the middle who want voting easy and cheating hard, but they've got some legit worries. It's like, what if this happens? What if that happens, et cetera. As you're sitting today, I'm sure that Election Day is such a focus of yours. Do you mind sharing, like, what's keeping you up at night? I mean, we're inventing this whole new system. It's the Super Bowl for somebody who believes in civic engagement like yourself. So what's most keeping you up at night as you look ahead toward that important day in November? What do you worry about the most?
I'll tell you, we've got a lot of challenges. We do in a normal election, foreign interference and so forth. Potential vote fraud it's not a myth. It does happen. It's not widespread. It doesn't tilt statewide elections, but it does happen in sporadic instances in local races. But the thing that actually keeps me up at night is voter misinformation and lack of information. There just couldn't be a worse time right now for us to be going through what we're going through, because there's so little public confidence in government and expertise. And it's so hard for me and others in public office to share information. Normally, if you changed your election plan, you'd get on the road and and travel the state and explain it to folks in meetings and gatherings, and I just can't do that. I do 6 or 7 Zooms a day, and this is really helpful. I'm grateful for this opportunity. But I wonder about how many people I don't catch because they're not on the Zoom. You know, especially in the rural areas, we tend to have, historically we have turned out a little bit better in the urban areas, but there was a huge difference in the primary. Urban areas really turned out, and rural areas less so, because rural areas had harder time getting information about how to vote. So actually the thing that keeps me up at night the most is just concern about educating voters, about having enough resources and enough publicity to be able to explain all the changes, to tell people that they've got options now they didn't have, to explain to them that they can vote early and where to go to do that, and to explain to them that they can vote absentee now, and how to fill out that ballot correctly. We had about 5% of our ballots in June that weren't counted because of fatal voter error. They didn't sign where they were supposed to sign, or they made some other technical mistake, and the law doesn't let us count those ballots. And that's historically low as a percentage of spoiled ballots, but it was 5% of a whole lot of ballots because we had a much bigger absentee proportion this time. So that's what keeps me up at night, is just the inability to reach more people. It's really frustrating in this time to have such a great need to get the message out and be so handicapped in the ability to do it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I never thought that we would, that one of the dominant themes in an election season would be the U.S. Post Office. In my mind, it's sort of a choose your conspiracy. So if you're a conservative, just tune into Fox and you'll hear a conspiracy. If you're a liberal, tune into MSNBC and you'll hear a liberal conspiracy for the post office. As Secretary of State, and again, I think the governor has been very clear that you and he see the landscape in a pretty similar way. Should we be worried about, depending on where you are politically, which post office theory is in play that's overblown? You've made some comments about just overload. Can you? I don't think we can talk about the election season without talking about the post office. Can you give us some reflections on that?
Sure. I'll tell you, I've not had any problems with my own mail at the office or at home, but I do hear of instances in other places where they do. My view of why the primary was such a great success is we gave people options. We didn't put all our fish in one barrel. We gave people an absentee option by mail, an absentee option by drop box, an early voting in-person option, and an election day in-person option. And that's why it worked so well, is people had choices and they could pick what was best for them. We're doing the same thing for November. One big difference, though, is last time we pushed people to vote absentee if they could, because we had so few voting locations, so few poll workers. This time we're not doing that as aggressively. We're making that available to people who perceive that they need it, but we're not pushing them, and here's why. We calculated that we could handle roughly 100,000 absentee ballots. That was the load capacity that we could handle between our postal ability and also the county clerk's manpower to process these absentee ballots. They're the ones who are responsible for issuing them and getting them back and counting them. My view is we probably can't get much north of 1 million, otherwise our system could break. We could end up losing ballots, or they could be delayed in the count significantly. So my goal was to preserve absentee voting for people who perceive a risk and don't want to vote in person, but also to encourage people who don't have that concern to instead vote in person and make that easier to do early or on election day, because we had about 75% of the vote absentee in June. That was 75% of 29% turnout. 29% is pretty good for a primary, but again, it's 29%. My prediction is we're going to have 72% turnout in November.
Well,
you can't take 75% of 72%, because then you're looking at 2 million absentee ballots, not about 750,000. So again, I want to preserve that for people who need it. I don't want to take it away and go back to 2% absentee as we had before this year. But also, I don't want to put too much strain on one part of the system. Think of this as a three-legged stool: absentee voting, early voting in person, election day in person. If we put too much weight on one leg of the stool breaks. So our goal here, and the governor's fully on board, is we want options available for everybody. We also want to message to people that they really do have options, and hope that they take advantage of all three in roughly proportionate ways.
the other thing that I so appreciate, Mr. Secretary, is I seldom hear you talk about this without you placing a primacy on equity, that voting is an opportunity and an obligation for every citizen. The folks on this call represent lots of different constituencies that tend to be marginalized. Rural voters, young voters, folks in poverty, citizens of color. I mean, we know demographically that those tend to be underrepresented. And my view, at least in Kentucky, is it's not a Democratic or a Republican edge. You can take each of those demographics and say, frankly, that favors Republicans, that favors Democrats, if we're honest. But you have been very consistent, almost a clarion call, that we've got to do more to do electoral equity, not just advocacy. You're talking to folks who are real champions on this issue. So coach us up, Mr. Secretary. How can we make marginalized citizens engaged and really making sure that they exercise that treasured right to vote?
You know, I'll be frank, it's hard right now. September is National Voter Registration Month. We put out a statement yesterday and did some media interviews, but we also released our recent statistics for registration, and they're a little bit better than they were at the bottom of the shutdown earlier this year for the pandemic, but they're really pretty weak over the same period. So we looked at June and July. This time last year, we had 167,000 new registrants to vote in June and July. This time we had about 20,000. So it's a big dip. It's an 8-to-1, I think 7-to-1 dip. It's hard to get anything done right now. It's hard to reach people and do voter registration drives. It's hard to recruit poll workers. We're really in challenging times. I would urge you to be creative, and I'd urge you to look for little ways to make a difference. I'll give you an example. I won't tell you what county it was and get the clerk in trouble, but one nice thing of the governor and me personally reviewing and certifying these election plans is I heard some complaints from a particular county from their African-American community that based on where their polling locations were put, the parts of the county that were more African-American didn't get their own polling location, and the other parts did. And that was perhaps innocent, probably was innocent, but still it was insensitive. And it led to people who are African-Americans having a difficult time getting to the polls to vote in person. So I think it's lots of things. It's looking at these election plans that are produced by your county clerks to look for potential inequities. We want to make sure that every community is equally treated. This is an equal protection issue. It's also letting your legislators know what you think. And for that matter, me and the governor. We're doing our best here under difficult circumstances. I think we've got challenges that no governor or secretary of state has faced in a long time, if ever. We're doing our best, but we don't know everything. And it's hard for us to get out of the bubble of the state capitol and visit with people and see what we're missing. So I would encourage you to don't be shy. I read every single constituent letter I get. I get several every day. We care what people think. We really do. So reach out.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a big picture question to end this because I want to be sensitive to your time, but there is no way I'm going to let you get off without you talking for just a moment about that recruit young poll workers on the side of craft brew cans. So how in the world did you come up with that, and tell folks about it in case they don't know, because I think that's just a fascinating approach.
Well, thank you. Yesterday was National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. There's a day for everything, apparently. So we used that day to launch an initiative. There are on beer can, on labels on beer cans around the state, labels that say SOS from your SOS. There's a message from me that tells people that we're at a critical need for poll workers, and it directs them to govoteky.com. Govoteky.com is the website where you can register to vote. You can update your information if you change your address or so forth. You can get your absentee ballot, or you can volunteer to be a poll worker. It takes 15,000 poll workers to run an election in Kentucky. In June, we had fewer than 2,000 volunteers. That's why we had so few voting locations. That wasn't a policy idea of mine or the governor's. It was a reality that we had to work around, is we just didn't have poll workers to have voting locations. We're doing a little better for November so far. Our portal by itself has attracted 3,000 poll worker volunteers. Again, that's 20% of what we need, but it's a good start as of early September. But our thought was, this is a generational problem. I testified to the legislature last year before I was sworn in that we have a poll worker crisis in our state. And that was before COVID-19. We've got an aging generation of greatest generation and baby boomer poll workers who are hitting retirement age for being poll workers. They're especially susceptible to harm from this virus. And it's difficult for me to ask them to re-up this time. So we have a even greater need for younger people, my generation, Generation X, millennials, others. You read a lot about how millennials are service-oriented. I see that every day in other respects. I need them to be civic-oriented if they can. I need them to volunteer to help the government run an election. I don't want to disenfranchise anybody, but I don't have my own standing army. I've got to have volunteers. I've got to have people who are willing to put in a 12-hour a day for $100. And so to try to reach young people, I advertised on beer cans.
I think that's so creative. Hey, I know we're 17 seconds long because I want to respect your time frame, but I want to give you an opportunity to kind of, the folks you're looking at virtually, they're the real leaders for groups that serve kids and families across this state. Give them some marching orders. I don't think there's anybody on this call that does not want fully franchised, full-throated participation on election day. What can we do? What's your final admonition and challenge to us?
I'd say make a plan for yourself and others, especially people who might have a challenge voting, whether it's an elderly person who needs to be kept away from in-person voting, but doesn't have a computer or doesn't have reliable internet access. What's your plan to reach those people? At my office, we hired a director of outreach for rural areas because we saw a huge difference in the turnout, the use of the govoteky.com portal for absentee ballots in, say, Frankfort, Lexington, Louisville versus Harlan and Paducah. We saw a big dip in rural usage of that, so I hired a rural outreach director to do nothing but focus on reaching those people. So we put out flyers to the Meals on Wheels community. When they got their meal, the shut-ins, they also got a flyer from our office explaining how they could vote, what their options were, and how to utilize those. So I'd say make a plan, certainly for yourself, figure out what's best for you, but also the people that you know in your communities, whether it's finding them transportation to get to the polls. We had free transportation. Louisville and Lexington did on election day in the primary. The buses ran for free to get you to your polling site. So whether it's getting transportation for people, whether it's getting them access to govoteky.com or other access to absentee balloting, figure out what works best for your community and then drive them in that direction. And if we can be a resource, let us know.
Great. Mr. Secretary, I know you have an incredibly busy schedule, and I so appreciate you joining us. Speaking for Terry Brooks, not for the rest of the world, there's a lot I admire about you, but your capacity to plow that common ground is so unique, so rare, and so needed. I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Great to be with you all. Thanks so much. Hope to see you again sometime soon.
Okay. In just a moment, I'm going to kick to Jessie, and she's going to talk a little bit about toolkits, and then she's going to have a conversation with John Tilley. I would be absolutely remiss if I did not Bigfoot her and tell you that in John Tilley, you're going to hear a rare voice. As a representative from Hoptown, Representative Tilley worked in a bipartisan way to reinvent the juvenile justice system in Kentucky. And he was a national leader. You may agree or disagree with Governor Bevin on many, many issues. I didn't hear anybody not think that Governor Bevin made a great choice when John Tilley became his secretary for the Justice Cabinet. In that role, again, he really forged common ground solutions on both criminal and juvenile justice. That we're not going to talk justice with the secretary today. We're going to take him back to the days of running for the House in a purple part of the state. So it's genuine Republican versus Democrats down there in Western Kentucky. And we're going to probe him a little bit on what you and what I need to be doing for those candidates in our legislative districts and in broader races as well. So you're going to be in for a real treat listening to John Tilley. Before we get into that, Jesse, I'll kick it to you.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you. I know Secretary Adams had to hop off because he had to get to something else, but hopefully he can hear me now. Thank you to Secretary Adams. I think in like half a second, my son is going to come running through, like just waving the American flag. And then the Hamilton soundtrack is going to start playing in the background, because every time I listen to Secretary Adams, I just want to be like, oh my gosh, I love being an American and a Kentuckian. And like, you know, you really like think back to those things in your heart that you like learn in civics class and that you love about our country, right? We're going to talk a little bit about electoral advocacy, because voting is a really important part of like our civic duty, but also beyond voting is electoral advocacy, which is engaging candidates in general. But of course, we want to talk about engaging candidates around specific issues related to kids. And to help get that conversation started and to help get your mind kind of thinking about that, we here at KYA have put together a very short toolkit to ready yourselves and to hopefully get your candidates up to speed a little bit, because electoral advocacy is a great opportunity to educate candidates, to educate, often that means educating an incumbent. So I'm going to share my screen and show you this toolkit. We're just going to do this for a minute. All right, can you see my screen? All right, so this is a short toolkit with just a few slides in it about the importance of electoral advocacy, keeping kids front and center, because kids cannot vote, so you have to ensure that their voices are heard by talking to candidates. So before you begin, it's really helpful to check out some data in your area. So we've listed some things here. Many of you are familiar with the Kentucky Kids Count project. There's also a lot of data available at the county level, like by race and ethnicity. Check out some past policy wins related to kids. You can check out our COVID-19 Action Hub. And also there's some national data about the effects of COVID-19 on kids and families. And we're going to send this to you all as a PDF. And all of these are links that you can click on to actually go and see that data for your area, your district, to talk to your candidate. So the first thing you want to ask them, what are your policy priorities related to kids and families? We know kids can often be an afterthought in legislation. So this really encourages your candidate to think about kids, think about families, and articulate specifically what they're going to do for kids and families. And then think, what about our kids? So what about within our district? Looking at that data, if we know that, for example, a high number of kids are living in poverty, or a high number of kids are in the child welfare system, what are you going to do about those things specifically? And then think bigger. How do your policies serve the needs of every Kentucky kid? So if you live in a district in Jefferson County, how are the policies that you're promoting going to affect kids in Eastern Kentucky or in Southern Kentucky? Or if you are from a mostly white district in Eastern Kentucky, how will your policies affect kids of color who live in an urban area? So all the different ways that our kids are diverse, how are your policies going to serve those? What have you done for kids lately? So if you're an incumbent, or if your candidate is an incumbent, you can look at their voting record. You can see how they've spoken up for kids in the media. If they're not an incumbent, find out what their commitments are to kids and families in a personal way, in a professional way, in a community way. But really try and pin them down on some specifics. And this isn't really a question, but it's an important reminder to thank your candidates. Also, anytime you can thank your elected officials, please do. Thank yous go a really long way. And we know that amidst all the toxicity of politics in Frankfurt or DC or wherever, that positive reinforcement is really important as advocates, as elected officials. And the more we can praise folks for putting kids first, we hope that that inspires other elected officials to do the same thing. So these are 5, really like 4 questions and a reminder that we've put in this toolkit. So we're going to send this to you after the forum is over, and it's also available on our website. So this is just to help you get started. And now we're going to get some specific insight from Secretary Tilley. So as Terry mentioned, Secretary Tilley served in Governor Matt Bevin's cabinet as the cabinet secretary for justice. He was the only Democrat in that cabinet. And then you served for 5 terms, right? From House District 8, which is the Hopkinsville area. So if we want to talk to someone who has some experience as a candidate and as bringing people together and championing issues in a real honorable way, as Terry said, there's no better person that we could talk to. So Secretary Tilley, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll give you like a little Hamilton fanfare or something once I get that music working. So,
yeah.
So thank you for joining us today. And we just want to get a sense of what should or could constituents expect of their candidates during election season. We know that candidates have a lot of stops. They got a lot of stuff they got to do. So what is it that we can expect from our candidates, or what should we push to expect from them in terms of contacts and outreach and making space for communication?
Well, let me first say thank you for the kind words from you and Terry. I'm not sure how deserved, but I grew up with a number of different political perspectives, and folks often would ask, why do you approach things in a nonpartisan way, or how are you able to reach across the aisle and just treat different philosophies and ideologies the same. And it just probably began at the dinner table in a very honest way. I don't know that there was any special effort to do that. So I would start by saying, and I appreciate, the Secretary's comments as well, Secretary Adams, to the extent that I think people ultimately, even as partisan as they may get in terms of their support of a candidate, they ultimately, at their core, want us to accomplish something. And oftentimes, the fringes don't allow for that. That hyper-partisanship doesn't allow for accomplishment. It doesn't allow for a compromise. I mean, there's no compromise, sadly, in some corners has become a dirty word. And ultimately, without it, oftentimes nothing gets done. And I would caution folks, even as closely held and as much as I respect, everyone's belief on a certain issue, I would caution folks to not so quickly embrace whether it's legislation or policy change that is rushed through in a partisan way, that isn't properly vetted and discussed with good, honest discourse and really public discourse, the opportunity for the public to weigh in. And so, but back to I'm sorry, I again wanted to touch on that because I think it's at the heart of what we all should aspire to be as elected officials at any level. But I think what we should expect from our officials is authenticity, honesty. I think oftentimes those who run look at poll numbers and want to become something that their constituents want them to become. And while it is critically important to listen to your constituents, you've got to mesh those two and combine what to be, for instance, good public policy with what your constituents want. I remember getting an email from some great folks back home that I knew, and they said in the email, it was essentially, we sent you to Frankfurt because we believe that you would be someone who would listen, who would educate themselves on the issues, who would take the knowledge that you have, the experience you have, the life experience, the professional experience, and then use that, but also listen to the incredible and vast resources that are around whether it be through committee testimony, experts coming in, again, people signing up to voice support or opposition to legislation. Listen and open up your mind and then make a decision in our best interest. So it's not always about following exactly what poll numbers indicate, because oftentimes, when someone weighs in on an issue, they're not hearing the full story. And I think that's a little bit moving over into what is, the ethics of serving in office. There's a book out about those very kinds of ethics, that you should vote what you know to be good public policy, oftentimes, rather than what you know is politically expedient or politically popular for you or your district. And oftentimes those two don't always connect. I mean, oftentimes what's best for the district may not be what is favored, but it's your job as an elected official to make the case often, and make it as many times as you have to before people begin to see it. And I could point to many examples of that during a 15-year run in politics. And I'm still working in a nonprofit world and consulting in a way that connects to it. But again, be authentic. And then, I think the second part of your question, I don't want to, it was, how do we reach out, especially now amidst COVID? I think, obviously social media, as much as I think so much is lost on various forums, that, I'm one who thinks it's nearly impossible to capture anything in in one line. I mean, it's oftentimes there's so much beneath the surface, so much that needs to be said, but there are ways to connect clearly, through social media, through, these kinds of calls. I mean, again, it occurs to me you could, have town halls this way, but, practicing all the guidelines right now during the pandemic, you could still get together and still have meetings, town hall meetings, make yourself available, get out and see people as best you can during this, but always respecting the need to be within those pandemic guidelines, whether they be the CDC guidelines or your own state's guidelines.
So I won't spoil anything that's coming up that we'll share a little bit later, but I think virtual town halls sound like a great idea. So we'll speak about that a little bit more. So thank you, Secretary Tilley. I think that's really important what you brought up about that authentic discourse, both as an elected official in Frankfurt or, DC, if that's the case. But I think that authentic discourse is really important between advocates and their candidates and advocates and their elected officials. And we often hear, elected officials say, oh, please take the opportunity to educate me on whatever the issue that you care about is, because that's, I think the really great elected officials admit what they don't know. So what are some ways that advocates, like what is helpful or was helpful to you as a candidate to start that authentic conversation or to really build you up as a champion for an issue? If a Frisky came to you and said, we are seeing so many kinship caregivers in our area and we need to make policy change, what would be helpful for them to give you, for you as a candidate to start thinking about those policies, or you as an elected official?
Well, you hit on two that are near and dear to me. I mean, Friskies, obviously the big thing for me as a legislator was, when they came to advocate for funding, was to see that return on investment and to understand the way they met children in need and families in need, and not just that incalculable return on investment, but the real return on investment with dollars and cents. And that was something, that ROI is something that taxpayers, whether you're on the left, right, or the middle, you deserve, that you deserve for your tax dollar to be invested wisely. And I always thought that Friskies, began the conversation by saying, not only is it just a good thing to do, an inherently good thing to work at that level with those resources for families and children in need, and working through schools where you meet, where you find out who really needs those resources to succeed and to thrive, and how often parents need that assistance as well. That being said, again, that's that beyond that incalculable good, that inherent good, there is that taxpayer return on investment. And then, you mentioned the kinship care. I mean, when I was a young lawyer, I used to go and work to the local area development district and talk about ways in which, again, the legal system could impact, those providing care to a child that maybe unexpectedly, and that wise investment and that kinship care, those dollars always seem to be on the chopping block. And I know several times when I was in office, those resources were scarce, and they shouldn't ever be, especially to support those who are taking on an added responsibility. And so you start with that. Those authentic conversations are talking about the facts. I mean, again, I don't mean this to criticize, but as if we're talking about what to expect and what to demand in some sense from your candidates and those in office, hold their feet to the fire on speaking about real things, about real policy, about their votes, about what they really support. Follow the votes, follow their actions, and don't pay as much attention to the rhetoric and these platitudes that oftentimes just flow. And that doesn't mean, they're bad people, and they may be doing great things after they, again, say certain things. But I would follow up. I would, the proof is there. Attendance, committee assignments, committee attendance, votes in committee. Watch how often they abstain when they're sitting in their seats. And why did they abstain? There may be a very good reason, a legal reason, but oftentimes oftentimes they hide behind that abstention. And, I don't ever remember actually ever abstaining on a vote. Maybe I did, but I don't ask for any reward for that. But I just think there's so much caution out there too. I think the best way to serve in office, if you want just a money shot here, you have to be willing to lose it. You have to be willing to be tossed out, to have the freedom to do what's right and to do what will work in government. It doesn't always be I can give you many examples of that, but I can promise you this: criminal justice reform and all the things, and drug policy reform, and some of the ideas that be considered too progressive for this or too conservative, all the criticism you get in that space, especially when I started talking about it, back in 2008. That wasn't the most popular thing. And there have been many candidates who've lost elections because they were turned soft on crime. But ultimately, we know it's about being smart on crime, actually enhancing public safety, getting people who need treatment for addiction and mental illness the right kind of resources. So demand these kinds of conversations, whether it be education policy or roads and bridges, or criminal justice, or healthcare. Demand that they know what they're talking about.
Okay, I feel like there are no more inspiring words that we could close out on than that. Demand that they know what they're talking about, and the best way to serve in office is to be willing to lose it. That I got nothing there though. Yeah, that's great. So that's a call to action to everyone here to demand the right thing of your candidates. So I feel like we could spend a whole hour with you, Secretary, and maybe we'll have a chance to do that sometime soon. But I think your sentiments about firing up these folks to fire up their candidates, we so appreciate that. So thank you so much again for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Ben Geese, who's going to close us out and give us a preview of effort that we have coming up that'll give us the opportunity to engage some candidates.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jesse. And before I go any further, I want to extend a most heartfelt thank you to Secretaries Adams and Tilley for joining us today. We very much appreciate your leadership, your strong support for kids and families, and also your statesman-like approach to approaching good governance in a form of bipartisanship. I think that's something that is sorely lacking in Kentucky, our country today. And thank you for stepping outside of that box and being the leaders that we all need and we all deserve. We appreciate that very much. We piggyback on Jesse's teaser from earlier and Secretary Tilley's wonderful suggestion of online virtual forums. Kentucky Youth Advocates will be hosting several of those forums throughout the month of September and into early October for a number of candidates, both for the State House and the State Senate. So please stay tuned in your inboxes for those invitations. Those will not be taking place as a part of our normal Wednesday morning forum, but will rather happen in their own exclusive time. So please, please, please take action, act upon what you've heard here today by signing on and holding those candidates and incumbents accountable through your vote, through your voice, and really just through your eyes and ears, paying attention to what they're doing, what they're saying, and what they plan to do for us and for kids. In addition, I want to give you a little bit of an advertisement for next week. Next week, we will be discussing kinship families and some of the challenges that they have incurred due to the pandemic, and also creative solutions that we have in ensuring that we continue to support kinship givers and kinship families throughout the state, and of course, the kids that they serve. So without further ado, I simply want to, again, thank you all for joining us today. We believe in the power of the vote. We believe in your power as citizens. And we believe that come November the 3rd, 2020, we're going to make a big statement about how kids are valued in our Commonwealth. So we urge you to stay active and to do your civic duty to vote. So thank you all very much.